on this computer.
There we go.
All right. So welcome again. If anyone just popped in, we are going to get started, and Jeff is going to start us off with why we're doing this and what we're doing.
So Megan and I were talking about the need to do an adult ed class, and I felt like the whole COVID pandemic thing had been talked to death, but yet we needed to respond to it and wanted to have a different perspective on responding to it, particularly a faith perspective, but that raises a lot of really complicated issues. So I realized that I was having conversations with different people that were really interesting. I said, you know what, I'm gonna bring them all together in one spot. So everyone knows Megan, which I don't know where she is on your screen, she's on my left. And then Eric is on the other side of me. Eric, wave, there's Eric. And there's Kristen. Kristen, if you can wave, there's Kristen. And then there's Steve Ogg. And so I assigned, whatever you want to say it, each of them to read this book by N.T. Wright on God and the pandemic. And then I basically said, I've had interesting conversations with all of you, and so I want to invite you to have an interesting conversation with the whole church. And so we said, this is the only way we can do it. So here we are, Megan.
Awesome. And I assume that most of you didn't read the book. Jeff kind of announced for a couple of weeks that we were going to be using this book to kind of facilitate our conversation. But for those who didn't read it, or for those who did and recognize that N.T. Wright is a very dense writer, Jeff, could you give us a little quick summary of, what is this book about? What is N.T. Wright trying to do with this little book?
Yeah. So N.T. Wright got asked by the editors of Time magazine to write a response, a Christian response, a faith response to the coronavirus. And he did, and he talked a lot about the word lament. And we'll go into that later. And he got huge criticism. People said, no, we want an answer. We want to know why this happened, and we want to know what we're supposed to do. And I felt like there was this massive disconnect from what he was trying to say that I thought was extraordinarily helpful, and to what people were hearing him say. And so as I was reading this book, he hits certain really important points that I think resonate in this whole book. And what he's going to say, and we can play out and develop in this, is that the Christian response to this is prayer, because we're always called to pray to invoke the presence of God in our world. It's going to be lament or grieving, because the scriptural witness of how God interacts in brokenness is grief. And then there's going to be the element of a faith response, a work. And that's something that we can play out as well. But basically in this whole book, as he lays it out, it's a short book, and you can read it in an afternoon. It's this idea of Christian response to this whole thing is going to revolve around prayer, grieving, and then engaging. And if you don't have all three of those, he's saying it's going to be very easy to miss the response that we're called to make as believers.
So that's kind of where we're going, what we're going to tease out. But we want to have some actual dialogue and conversation among the group. But I told Jeff ahead of time, I'm selfishly most excited to hear from Eric. Eric is a PhD in psychology. And I think that like faith and psychology are really important as we both what N.T. Wright is saying, but also as we come to understand as Christians what's going on with the world right now. So Eric, I would love, for you to kind of start us off just by, what are your colleagues and you, like, how do you talk about the psychological toll of this moment of the pandemic on our world?
I think you have to go back and look at where we were at even before the pandemic. And I remember even having conversations with you, Megan, in our small group about what's going on with the emotional health in our society. What's up with all the anxiety, depression? There's been a lot of really difficult emotions that a lot of people are going through. I think that's the framework that really set up our society as we kind of navigate this pandemic. I think in general, we're in a time where we don't handle negative emotion very well at all. And when it happens, we try to disconnect, we try to run from it, we don't want to deal with it. And that's one of the reasons why we oftentimes have so many difficulties, is we're working so hard to get away from the negative emotions that we experience, that we actually dig ourselves into a much deeper hole. You know, and it varies from person to person, but general trends that we see, that most people oftentimes try to numb out or distract themselves when they're not feeling okay. And we've got a plethora of things to do that, from our phones and Netflix and social media and all those kinds of things. Or we overachieve or overcommit ourselves, because if we're busy, we never have to slow down to think, wow, like I'm actually really dissatisfied with my life right now. And those are a lot of the things that were on the front end of this pandemic, is that we just really don't know how to handle negative emotions. So we always feel compelled to do something to get that emotion to go away. So we take that and then we put a pandemic on top of that. And that's, I think, where we are right now. With any major disaster, there's always going to be a psychological impact that occurs. Of course, that makes sense. And we're seeing that with this pandemic. We're seeing increases in anxiety, helplessness, all those kinds of things that you would expect to have happen, because it is difficult. And then on top of that, we're also seeing a lot more fatigue. I mean, this thing is dragging on. This is not like a Hurricane Katrina that happens, it's terrible, and then we rebuild. It's like, how long is this catastrophe going to carry on for? So there's a lot of fatigue in that. I think what we're seeing, though, in this situation is that some people are, maybe people before the pandemic were doing okay and now they're not doing okay. Or maybe they weren't doing okay before the pandemic and now they're doing much worse. And there are some people that, and I can think of a lot of college students that I know, that they weren't doing well before the pandemic, but now they've gone home and now they're isolated in their rooms, and that's a safer place for them. So we can't say that everybody is necessarily worse off, but in general, there's a lot more psychological distress. And I know I'm rambling here, but I'll wrap this up here in a second. But I think one of the things that what we're seeing in the mental health field is that a lot of people are, when they're feeling all these extra emotions of the pandemic, they go back to all those ways that they were dealing with the pandemic before it happened. Like, how can I numb out? How can I distract myself from this? How can I not have to deal with this? And those are the people that those types of strategies to manage negative emotion don't work very well when things are like this. And so people get they start digging themselves further in the ground. They start feeling a lot more heaviness. And so I think as we approach this from a church perspective, from an individual perspective, from our families, we have to really think about, how are we going to choose to respond to these uncomfortable feelings that we have? Like, I don't like feeling nervous about what's going to happen. I don't like the grief. I don't like any of these emotions. But I know that if I push them away, that's going to make it a lot worse. So I have to really be thoughtful about, how am I going to choose to respond to this difficulty in this time? And I think we'll talk about more of that, will flesh out as we talk about this book together.
Yeah. One thing that you were making me think about, N.T. Wright talked about worldviews, right? And he started the book with, talking about Stoics and Epicureans and Platonists. And Jeff, I can never remember which of those is which, so I'm going to ask you in a second, just getting you ready. But yeah, so our worldview maybe has affected, is what I'm hearing you say, Eric, of how we've responded to this, that, the numbing out or the view of the world, has an impact on that. So Jeff, I'm going to push it back to you. Explain kind of, N.T. Wright talks about those different, big schools of thought, but then how do you think that most Americans, Christians, what is the worldview most of us are operating under? And then maybe we can throw it back to Kristen or Steve about how that's maybe made the pandemic harder.
Yeah, so N.T. Wright in the book was talking about some of the responses we've done, and he's pulled up these old Greek philosophies that are still very prevalent. So Epicureans, what are Epicureans? Epicureans were people that believe that life is all about the simple pleasures that sustain you. And so you just focus on the simple things that entertain you, distract you, make you feel better, i.e. Netflix, i.e. binge watching stuff on TV, i.e. FaceTiming a friend, whatever it is. You focus on the simple pleasures because that's all that life is really about. and you just then wait. It's almost like there is no grand story to life, so you just keep doing the simple things that entertain you until the point where this goes away and there's new things to entertain you. So you can see that, I can see that all around me, that, you see how grumpy people get when they've gone through all their Netflix shows and there's no new Netflix shows to come out. People do not like that. The Platonic view is more of saying death isn't the end, but Platonic view is that, the body's just a prison for the soul, and when you die, it's not going to be that bad because your soul will go someplace else. So really, in the end, nothing really matters. So don't get too worked up about this. Just accept that life is meaningless. And I think that I've seen a lot more Epicurean response, but I do see a lot of people who get depressed say, there's no point to this. This isn't going to end. There's nothing you can do about it. I'm going to crawl in my cave and hide, wait, whatever. And part of the thing that I think the reason that NT brings those up, besides the fact I think they're very prevalent worldviews right now, is that also you have a kind of thing where beyond that, there's a worldview from a faith perspective that is actually radically different. And it's a faith view that has been, dare I say, corrupted or watered down to the point where it's no longer a predominant view in our culture, even within, or particularly within, the church itself. And part of this is trying to say, where do we regain that worldview that actually gives us a strength to not only participate, but the guidance on how to grieve, the guidance on how to pray, and the ability to be present in this moment. And I think that's sort of where the worldview that he's hoping that we'll find in Scripture and embrace and participate in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he says that even Christians tend not to have that Christian worldview. He used that like vending machine theology, or this idea that we want God to be for us, right? And people at OPC have heard me and Tyson use that language too, of we put in our prayers or we put in our good deeds and God works for us, but he's trying to give a bigger worldview. Yeah, and so guys on the panel, you guys can speak into these as well. Otherwise, I'll just keep shooting questions at each of you individually. But Steve, pandemics are not new. There were plagues, there's been things throughout history that the church has responded to. And N.T. Wright brings that up, and I know you like that history stuff. What are some of the examples of the past, and how can we learn from them today?
Yeah, I assume that Jeff invited me because he knows I read a lot of history. But one of the things that Wright brings up in the book is the historical response from the Christian community, and specifically he cites passages that Luther wrote. And so, just as a personal anecdote, where it didn't, how it's my view of this has changed is 2 years ago was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. And so some friends of ours, Deb and I went with them, and 2 weeks in Germany, and it was basically a 2-week tour of kind of the path that Luther trod, in his time. We went to Wittenberg and we went to all these places. But in that tour, because you're talking about a time as the early 1500s, the subject of plagues came up. And needless to say, they seemed so remote, that whole discussion, because it seemed like a medieval thing, right? And so, but what's interesting now in the situation we're in, and Wright comments specifically on, is that the response that Luther, and even before that, the early Christians had, is probably worth dusting off, because the early Christians had not only a unique response from the rest of the culture they were in, but they also, to use modern term, they made a name for themselves. The history of early Christianity was as it grew was nonlinear. It grew a little bit, and then it would grow in a sort of a larger step. And it turns out that some of the biggest the broadening of the church came during or the result of pandemics. There was a pandemic in the I think it was the 2nd century, where in the Roman Empire there were a couple of big plagues, and one of them actually is believed to have killed off a quarter of the Roman Empire. But what happened is the most famous, look at my note here, the most famous plague was called the Plague of Cyprian. And it was named for a bishop who used to talk about how to deal with that plague in very, they said, graphic form back then. But it ended up, long story short, it ended up triggering the almost explosive growth of the Christian church back then. And basically it was because the Christians were taking care of each other, because they were while other people were fleeing or not knowing how to deal with it, or spending time trying to blame someone, the Christians were actually caring for each other. And so it set them apart from everyone. And so, like I say, history does like tie into that. There's a guy named Rodney Stark, he calls himself a sociologist and a religious demographer, which I'd never heard of before. But apparently I found he's amongst sociologists and historians, he's fairly famous. But that they've done historical reviews and said that they believe that death rates in cities with Christian communities back then may have had just half of the death and the impact that other cities did. And that was because the Christians were actually dealing with it. I think that the other interesting point is that when you jump up to what Luther's take is that it was completely consistent, if not absolutely, required of Christians that they care for each other. That you could tie right back to Jesus' teachings, and that the response to that, basically, this sort of famous tract he wrote on this said, in the time of a plague, said basically everybody at their battle stations, the pastors and the church will stay on to help and work with their parishioners. What they called the governors back then, which is basically the political people, they need to stay on to help the people that are their constituents. And so that's at least an interesting discussion, because the comparison's been made, like this whole discussion of the use or the effectiveness or the appropriateness of masks, of requiring masks today. The comparison's been made is that somehow we've sort of lost this idea that it is the responsibility of Christians to not only help, but to also keep people safe. And that the translation was made is that masks are about keeping others safe. And that's what somehow in this country we seem to have gotten that tied up in a political discussion about masks. One other point I'd make is that in a discussion I saw between N.T. Wright and Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institute of Health, they got in a discussion that sort of was along these lines, noting the difference between this country and how we're dealing with it, and the Christians in this country and the Christians in Britain and Western Europe, because that's where N.T. Wright's from. He's from Britain. He saw that they even talk about it themselves, that there's a different response in this country relative to things like masks, and that we've sort of gotten away from the idea that if masks are to protect people, and it's our duty as Christians to help protect and protect people, then we probably have a different look at that. But it's been sort of lost in this political milieu. So anyway.
Well, what's interesting to me is we have in the US, actually in Europe as well, a much more privatized view of religion than what had happened in centuries past. And so, Kristen, I wonder if you could speak into that. So for the last 80 years, the church has increasingly had less of a role in the public sphere and has been pushed more into the private sphere. And that in terms of individuals' life, but corporately as well, that how has that affected the response to the pandemic. Increasingly people of, my generation, your generation, are less inclined to go to church or have, less positive feelings towards religion at all. How do you see the pandemic affecting that or affecting people's response to it?
Yeah. I'll take a step back first from the question, which is just that when I was reading this and rereading this, one of the pointers that I had was to kind of look at this in the context of culture, right? And kind of where we are as a culture and what is the message of the culture that's coming through. And yes, privatization is one of those. And that's definitely something. It's funny because it's the one that I've struggled with the most in preparation for this. And I really actually want to get your guys' view on some of these things that have begun to string together as thoughts in that. But just to really quick go back to what both something that Eric and Steve touched on, there's just this idea of the numbing out and avoiding of what's actually currently going on, which we know is such a kind of culturally enabled, or, and when I speak culture, I, of course, am not speaking about individuals. I'm not talking about what you're doing, what I'm doing, what I'm talking about, what is the message we're getting kind of in the up here talk that's out there in the world and being brought together as the kind of influencing narrative, right? That's out there for us. And one of the main things that really struck me in the context of that cultural message is we are right now in such a time of blame and shame and victimization and guilt and all of, basically trying to figure out whose fault is it. And this is kind of what Steve was talking to too, of like, where could we have changed this? Whose fault is this? And to the extent that I was hearing them do on like NPR, they were doing a full story about like, well, what if we had stopped it here? Okay, well then this fewer people would have died. Okay, but what if we had stopped it here? Okay, then this fewer people would have died. And it's like, are we crazy? Like we're going through all the different ways that we could have changed things, if only, right? And so really what N.T. Wright talks so much about in that vein is that that's not what people should or are or were in the past focused on, right? Like that is another way to escape, to be like, yeah, but we could have done all these things. That's not sitting right here in this chair and saying, okay, this is the situation we've got. Now, where do we move forward from here? And I think he has an actual quote that I have somewhere that I've probably lost, but about basically asking the three questions are, and you guys can remind me if I'm wrong on this, asking who is most at risk? Okay, in this moment, this is what the thing is. Who is most at risk? What do we do, and who do we send out? I think those are the three questions that he puts forward, right? So right now, the culture is giving us the blame here. You can escape into blame. You can escape into the past, the looking backwards. What N.T. Wright really brings is, okay, but no, let's look forwards. And he, of course, then within the book, speaks to this is how Jesus was approaching things. He was not sitting around blaming for like, okay, well, how could we have rewritten this? It's here's where we are. What do we do forward from here? And it's actually a really pragmatic kind of way to approach things. And again, to what Steve is saying of like, in the past, it was like, okay, pragmatically, who can we go keep from dying from this thing? Who can we, like, whatever it is. But it was the fact that there was this group of people coming together that were super visible and coming forward and saying, okay, we're now going to go out into the population and be visible and change things in whatever way we can somehow change things or help, not even change things, help things, right? And so then this leads me to kind of where I began to go with the whole concept of the private faith that I would be really interested in your guys' input on is, yes, faith has become a more privatized thing, mostly I think because it's like, I don't want to impose my faith on you. It's got a lot of that behind it, right? It's the like, oh, well, yeah, I do believe in God, but I don't want you to feel bad if you don't. So I'm just not going to talk about it. Or, and I'm, again, saying this as kind of, we talked some about the fact that there is multiple generations now who maybe are not coming to church and who are not having that as a point of identity, right? And of course, Jeff, you talk about identity in the church so often. And so I began to ask the question of like, where are people getting their identity now, right? And it's not, faith may be a private thing when we attach it to the word church, but belief systems are certainly not private right now. It is, I am gonna fill my Instagram with this thing that I'm, marching for, with this thing. I'm gonna wear the t-shirt with the whatever, and I'm gonna put both fingers up and say, okay, like, this is what I believe. And if you don't believe it, kind of the unspoken, and if you don't believe it, don't talk to me, or like, don't, like, you better back off, because it's become such a loud out there thing. And so I began to kind of think into this, like, that kind of shouting your beliefs, you don't have to actually believe any of those things. That's some sort of cultural connection thing that's happening, where it's all my friends, or all the people who are saying that I should believe this, I believe them, so I'm going to go ahead and believe that, and go yell about this, or do this march, or put this, completely meaningless little box around my picture on Facebook, or whatever it is. I'm going to make the nod to that thing very publicly. So I started then getting very, like, down the rabbit hole with this. And so I would love, I don't know, Eric, if you have anything on the psychology of it, but just the fact that, what is it that has made anything that's associated with capital T, capital C, the church, right? Everything, it was kind of like I wrote something that made sense.
Well, Kristen, what I think you're getting at is that politics has kind of become the new religion in the U.S. That what is public, what are we ascribing to a set of beliefs? It's actually often political parties, right? And that is, or that you're talking about all the different things that are happening right now, right? The different movements.
I mean, I do think you're correct in the fact that I think there is a socially accepted narrative that's out there, where if you're out of step with that narrative, I think a lot of those beliefs have gone underground. But I do think that there's something to be said about the fact that, like, if you ask Josephine Schmo on the street, why are you marching for the whales? Like, she has some story that is based in mending, healing, bringing together, something in that realm, right? Well, we know that's what we're doing here. We know we are here actively attempting to do our part to bring heaven to earth right now. And we know that that's healing, that's community, that's bringing together, we know that. So where I keep getting kind of like, I don't have the answer, is why is it that when all those things are put behind this wall of the church, that those who are not associated with the church are just like, they associate the church with division, exclusion, like, that is where I'm having the breakdown in thought. And I would love for your guys' thought on that, of people are ready and want the thing that we know is here, but somehow it's getting lost in translation.
Well, and I'll respond to that. I think some of that has to do with how the church has chosen to respond to really terrible, difficult things that have happened, that have come along. And because we're not, as Christians, because we're siloing our faith, because we're private in our experience of God, we oftentimes aren't bringing to the forefront, like, my life is really messed up right now. Hey, things are really falling apart. Now things are falling apart on a global scale, and the church is kind of reticent to respond. And I think that has to go back to that, we're going to get to it, but lament. What is lament? Lament is an individual thing, and it's a corporate thing. And within the church at large, we just have lost that ability to lament. The millennials and younger, they know how to numb out. There's no lament when you numb out. The older than the millennials, and these are all gross generalizations, those are the, like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, just pray about it. These are signs that Jesus is coming back tomorrow. Those, and while those can be ways that we can manage the difficult emotions, those really just mask them. And those really just temporarily make us feel better. We're not actually stepping in and being like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. Like, what's really happening? And I think that we're, as a church, and I'm talking about the church at large, we're missing a huge part about what it means to be Christian. And I think, you go back and look at the Psalms. There's a great quote. Gungar is a band that I used to listen to, and I kind of want to go back to it. But one time, the lead singer for Gungar came out and said that 70% of the Psalms, and this is true, 70% of the Psalms have lament in them. Yet 0% of the top 150 Christian worship songs have lament. 0%. So it's all over the biblical text, but yet it's not finding a way into our churches. I kind of understand lament through, there's this Old Testament theologian who I loved him in grad school, and I kind of think about him a lot, but his name's Walter Brueggemann, and he had it's kind of a simplistic but also deep understanding of the Psalms. And when we look at the Psalms, there's orientation, there's disorientation that occurs, and then there's reorientation that happens. And so we go through life and we're kind of in this normal equilibrium. Things are reasonably going okay. We like that place. That's our comfortable place. That's the American church. We love that comfortable space where things are in our control, where we have easy answers to why things happen and who goes to heaven and who doesn't and why this is happening, why 9/11 happens, why the pandemic happens. Well, this is why. But then disorientation happens. And that's the part where we feel like we lose control, and we experience helplessness, and we experience hopelessness sometimes. And that's where I think in our privatized faith, we push away from that. In our Christian American faith, we push away from that because things are supposed to be clean and okay, and we're supposed to be happy, and we're supposed to be. I remember when I was sharing my faith in Australia many years ago, I remember telling this one guy, this is very embarrassing, but I remember telling this one guy, your life is up and down like this, man, it's terrible. But when you know Jesus, it's going to just go like this, man. Every day is going to be, you're going to feel great. I worry for where that guy is right now. I hope that he found someone that can help him understand that the Christian life is also really, really difficult. And so Brueggemann talks about how in that disorientation time, like that's where when we honestly face that helplessness, that's when we can join with the Spirit in groanings that are too deep for words. That's when we can actually really be connected to what's really messed up in the world, and then also take steps and move forward. Because when we're in this place, we always want to go back. I want to go back to how things were before. But I don't think that's what God's calling us right now to. I think he's calling us, and as N.T. Wright would say, to be signposts for the kingdom and where things are moving toward right now. And through that disorientation, that's how we can become active, lament, feel that pain, but also then be motivated to make some adjustments and changes in how we do what we're doing. Because I think it's long overdue.
Well, and it
really
sounds,
do.
Eric, like what you're saying is that basically if there is a mentality of suffering should not be a part of my life, or suffering is somehow indicative that something's gone off the rails, I've done something wrong, I'm not a good enough Christian, whatever the association is with that. If I'm under the impression suffering is wrong, suffering should not be here, then it's probably that much harder to walk into lament, as opposed to just be like, oh, I just got to fix this, or I got to like somehow get this off of me, as opposed to being like, no, we are not separate from the world. The world is broken and in pain, and we talk about that. So why on earth wouldn't suffering be a part of our experience as well? Because we are part of the world.
And
yeah,
I think
creation is groaning for redemption, and we are a part of that as well. And it's like, I think in our Christian faith, a lot of times, if you're struggling, where's your faith, buddy? You shouldn't be struggling. Your faith should be, whatever it is. And it's like, no. If anything, I feel like the more that we're in touch with the way things are, the more broken our hearts are, and the more that we grieve and lament.
And I think in some ways we've made faith transactional, in that the idea being that if I believe in God, then God has to act on my behalf for my desires in this world. And you know where that comes from? That comes from pre-Christianity, Roman and Greek religions, where you offered sacrifice to bribe a God to do what you want. And I think oftentimes we tend to think of prayer as bribing God, a transactional relationship, as opposed to the place where, like the Psalms, as you were talking about, Eric, we pour out our heart to God, and then we find reorientation, we find the narrative again. And I think in a lot of the church, we've traded the narrative of being signposts, of being God's people in this world, of entering into pain as Christ entered into the pain and hurt of the world, to how can we market a feel-good message that people will come because they feel better when they come. And I think that we as a church as a whole have contributed to the shallowness of our culture by doing that.
Well, and then can I throw this in there? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Jeff, is also what I was really struck by when reading this book was so many of us who are in the church who grew up in the church, there's still this mentality of, yeah, but God's going to come save me. Like I am, and what I realized reading this was it's staying a child. It's staying in this like childhood, oh, but daddy's going to come save me mentality. And that is not empowering to get anything done in this world. And then if what N.T. Wright is saying, which is we are here as the tools through which the current heaven is being built right now, we need to like that completely shifts the narrative from, oh, I'm here, I can't do anything, he's going to come save me, to, oh, I am here as a partner in co-creation with the divine. And like, if anything is happening, it's not him coming in and swooping in and like, off I am. It's him coming in through me. So I am doing things on this planet to help others. Like, that is such a huge mind turn when that clicks in. And I mean, I think really that's like, I'm 36 and that's only the last few years. I'm getting close to getting that. You know what I mean? Like,
it's regaining the narrative. I mean, Megan, I think this is the perfect time for that Luther quote.
Well, no, because I think that we want to go to the do, and I actually want to go back because we've been throwing around the word lament, and I've heard in the chat that some of you don't know what that means or want us to define it and explain it because they didn't read the book, whereas the 5 of us did. So yes, Jeff, we'll go there. But first, Eric, I would love you to explain what is lament when in the book N.T. Wright talks about, us needing to grieve before action. I gave you a couple of quotes like lament that leads to action, or grief is a part of love. It's a couple of things that N.T. Wright said in the book. First, explain what lament is, what we're talking about, and then before we get to, because I do, Jeff, want to get to that Luther quote for you. But yeah, help us understand that as a whole.
Yeah, and it's I think the easiest way to think about lament is it's really grief that is expressed. It's almost like the action of grief, of grieving. To lament is to really to step into that, to experience, to not fight it away, to really experience the richness, which sounds like a terrible thing to think about, of loss and of what really has occurred. And so that is to lament. And it's not necessarily to stay in it forever, like, okay, well, we're just going to heap ashes on ourselves indefinitely forever. But no, it's really to dive in deep into it. N.T. Wright talks about how, I think the quote is, I think it was, grief is a part of love, I think was the quote. And what that's referencing is that, when we look at Christ, I mean, could you show more? He went through so much pain and sorrow and difficulty. Obviously, there's wonderful joys as well with the healing, but there was also immense grief and difficulty in what happened. And so that's love. And I want to love people well. And that's the image that I'm seeing of, this is how I can love, that there are these deep sorrows. And I think by grieving, by experiencing intense loss, lamenting, that makes us connected to the reality of the world that we're really in. And in that, it moves our hearts to take action. When we talk about that other quote, Megan, that you referenced, that lament leads us to action, that's what it does. It's because when our heart is truly at a loss, even a loss for words, is really broken with the broken, then we are moved to take action. I'll give you just a kind of a silly example, but I see people for therapy, like I'm the therapist. And so sometimes I can walk into a room and be like, well, this person's going through a lot of difficulty. I'm just going to fling some theory at them and give them some coping strategies and send them out the door. But when I pause and I try to sit alongside them and have empathy and really put myself in that place of pain that they're in, now I'm in it with them. And sure, not to the same extent that they're experiencing, but in ways I'm kind of lamenting, I'm kind of grieving with them. And those are the moments of connection that lead to the richest sessions that I have in therapy. And I think in ways, we're not all called to be therapists with people that are struggling, obviously, but we are called to have deep empathy, deep connection with the loss. Another comparison I think of is that in this time, it's very easy to know people that have maybe had the virus, but not often do we know people who have lost loved ones or who have died. But I'll tell you what, when you know someone who has been and you talk to them, you can really experience a real connection to the loss and the pain and the difficulty that comes from all of this. It's very easy to be indifferent to the pandemic. You know, I'll live inside my house 5 days ago by, and I'm like, I haven't even left my house. It feels just like things are normal, but they're not. And so I can lament in this time by reconnecting with the pain that is going on in society. And through that, then I am motivated to actually take action and be there for other people.
You know, one of the examples is when you look at Jesus at Lazarus' tomb. Jesus doesn't walk up and just say, hey, it's all good, I'm going to raise him from the dead. Jesus goes to the tomb and weeps. And he is present in the loss. And Mary or Martha is saying, if you had been here, this wouldn't happen. Why did God allow this? But Jesus pauses and enters into the pain of the moment. Instead of avoiding it or waving the magic finger and making it go away, he engages that. And I think that is the model of the way, you know, when people say, where is God in this? People are really saying, why did God allow this to happen? When what the scriptural witness is God is present in the pain and the hurt through God's people, just as God entered into the brokenness of the world through Christ on the cross. And the witness of Scripture is always God drawing near and entering into the pain, because until that's dealt with, the new life doesn't come. You can't skip grief, because it will, as Eric will tell you, it'll haunt you the rest of your life unless you enter into it and work through it and walk through it and find hope and reorientation on the other side. And I think that if the church proclaims a message, where is God in the midst of this? God is present on the front lines. A lot of people are going to go say, what are you talking about? Because what I really want you to say is that God's going to protect me or God's going to make this happen. But when we regain the real narrative of Scripture, then I think we actually have something real to say to a culture that's disoriented from the ability to grieve.
I see a parallel, Jeff, with that and confession. You know, that idea of, of really entering into brokenness, which makes us so uncomfortable, that's the only way we can move forward. We say that the only way you can really experience forgiveness and grace is through confession. It's through this recognition of our brokenness. And I think the same thing is true of the pandemic. The only way we can move forward to productive action is through that sitting in pain and lament and recognizing not just how this is affecting us, but how this is affecting the world, and seeing it through God's eyes of weeping, right? You're saying through Jesus of entering into that brokenness first. And that's then what gives us the ability to live for the other, to move forward. So the Luther quote that Jeff mentioned before is, I know Jeff's favorite part of the book, so I will read it all for us. But this was from a letter that Martin Luther, one of the founders of Reformation, started all that, wrote in 1527 in the midst of a pandemic situation there. And he said this: with God's permission, the enemy has sent poison and deadly dung among us. And so I will pray to God that he may be gracious and preserve us. Then I will fumigate to purify the air, give and take medicine, and avoid places and persons where I am not needed, in order that I may not abuse myself, and that through me others may not be infected and inflamed, with the result that I become the cause of their death through my negligence. If God wishes to take me, he will be able to find me. At least I have done what he gave me to do, and am responsible neither for my own death nor for the death of others. But if my neighbor needs me, I shall avoid neither person nor place, but feel free to visit and help him. All right, so why do you love that quote, Jeff? And how has that kind of informed your response to this pandemic?
So the thing that I love first about that is 500 years ago, they understood airborne disease. They understood social distancing. They understood how disease was spread. And they understood social responsibility in the midst of that to not bring others into a place of infection, right? So, like a lot of times we think, we are the first to get this. Like if you read back on the Spanish flu in 1917, 18, they wore face masks. They got it. We're not the first ones to go through this. That being said, then, look at the response. I'm going to pray that God preserve us, because that's my desire to be useful and present in this world. I'm not going to put anyone at harm, but I am not going to resist the calling placed on me to be present to help. And this is vintage Luther right here. And if God desires my life, God knows where to find me. That's not a flippant statement. That was someone who had gone through a period of massive social upheaval, where plagues were common, where people died all the time. But it was a statement of saying, my life isn't my own. And when you really comprehend that narrative that your life doesn't really belong to you, that it belongs to the God who gave it to you, that is an incredibly freeing statement, to say that I don't have to give in the desire to hide, to be away from everyone. I still have the responsibility to be safe and to take the safety of others seriously, but that there's a larger narrative to my life. And wherever I'm needed, I'm going to step in and play that role, because that narrative defines me, as opposed to the narratives that are floating around of Epicureanism or Plato, that life doesn't matter, or just go for the simple pleasures. It's a narrative that says that my life matters for this world and for God's kingdom, and only in losing my life will I find it. And I think it's a narrative that goes against I think in our current culture, the individualism has broken down a sense of meaning that you can only find in giving yourself away. And I think that the Luther quote to me was like, we're not the first ones to go through this, but are we going to be wise enough to learn from those who went before us as the appropriate way to respond to this? And that's why I love that quote so much.
Well,
So,
it
go ahead.
speaks to both sides of the pendulum, right? Where my life matters, therefore I'm not going to be flippant and go out and, just do whatever. And I'm not going to sit at home terrified and not leave my house no matter what, because I'm trying to preserve it in some way. I mean, it's really speaking to finding that place of correct walking forward in that meaning,
And I think most people know that my wife is an ER nurse, and there's a number of doctors in my family. And it's one of these things where I get lectures, my whole family gets lectures all the time on appropriate safety measures, because they take that really seriously. But taking that seriously, they hop into the front lines every single day they go to work, because they feel a sense of calling to bring healing. And you do that, it puts you in a place of pain. It puts you in a place of fear, because people around you are hurting and they're afraid and they're uncertain. And yet, when you hold the pendulum in the middle of personal safety, but also social caring, responsibility, narrative of my faith, it may be exhausting, but it's incredibly identity and life-giving.
So just a historical footnote to that, to Luther's comment. Say he was actually, back in 1527, when it was the bubonic plague hit, he was actually encouraged to flee to save his life. He didn't. He ministered and wrote made these tracts around this, and it actually cost him his daughter's life. He had a daughter named Catherine who actually succumbed to the bubonic plague. And so he did this at a lot of personal pain too, but believed and extolled what Christians needed to do at the time. The thing about that quote, and sort of reading more background on that, though, there's another part of that quote for me that it addressed a thing I've been wrestling with, and what it is that I don't ever remember. I'm hearing from people that would never ever in the past been faced with an issue and said, if the Lord's time, my time to go, it's time to go. And the context is why aren't you doing something to keep safe? Why aren't you observing sort of just practical, safety measures in the light of the pandemic? And like I said, it's very interesting, cultural, political phenomenon, whatever it is. But there's people that I know that are close, that, as well as not seeing these on the on the news and things like that, they're just like, well, why aren't you doing it? Well, it's if the COVID takes us, whatever. Now, this is the same people that the obvious question: why do you wear a seatbelt? Why do you do anything? Why do you take medicine if that's the case, right? But there's something different here, culturally, that I've been struggling with. But when I read that and read some more commentary on that Luther quote, he really is, reinforcing the point that that is not a Christian view, that we just don't care, and that we, if we infect others, others infect us, that's okay. That is not a Christian view, but somehow that's made its way in here. So I'd be interested in any of the rest of you comment on that.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask anyone on the panel, how do you think the church has done as a response to all this? We've talked about maybe what we should do or what we've done poorly or what has been done in the past, but I mean, not OPC specific, but the church in the US, how have we done at responding to this, at meeting people's needs, at sitting in the place of pain, at saying, I don't know, which is another quote from N.T. Wright. Yeah. What do y'all think?
I think there's been, I think it's been a mixed bag. I think that there clearly have been people of faith who have engaged not only in frontline first responder kind of situations and have done it from a faith perspective, which I absolutely applaud. I think there's been churches and people in a faith that have looked after their elderly neighbor, that have grieved with families that have lost people. I think there are people that have been present in lament, even though we may not call it lament. I think that there's been people who've donated generously to food banks to feed their neighbors in times like this. I think there's been some really good responses. The negative response that troubles me and that I have wrestled with myself is the recognition that we've lost the narrative of how to respond in times like this. And that's why the book's actually appealing to me, is trying to regain that narrative instead of, well, we can't meet, so we're just going to sit tight, or we're going to come up with 37 things that no one wants right now because everyone's exhausted from everything, because we've got to do something. And regaining the narrative means maybe that something is being present for the people in our world that are hurting. Maybe is being the neighbor who sees and cares regardless of whether these people are part of our congregation or not. And maybe it's learning how to pray again, that in our immediate context, God speaks into our lives of how we can respond and be signposts. So I think it's really a mixed bag, but I think the loss of narrative, the loss of history, the loss of understanding how those before us have responded is what's handicapped us.
Steve talked about like the way the church grew in the past after pandemics and things like that. So Kristen, Eric, I don't know who wants to jump in on this, but do you see this as an opportunity for OPC if we do kind of some of the things that N.T. Wright is talking about, Jeff just eloquently put? Is there opportunity to reach people? Is that appealing? Growth for the church, or being present to our neighbor, all that kind of stuff.
I mean, I struggle with this because we didn't stay at our battle stations. We're not in church. We are in what N.T. Wright calls exile. And so it is something that I struggle with, in that it's become a personal, okay, what can I do thing, as opposed to a, what is, we aren't in the plague with a group of 20 of us going out and taking care of people. Like, that is not what is happening right now. So the idea that that kind of growth from the church, which was so much about being so visible in the community doing good as a group, that's not available right now. That's not, it's just a really difficult thing to try to do. And if anything, there's persecution for doing that at this moment, of like, what are you doing gathering more than 10 people to do anything, you know? So I definitely struggle with it. I do hope and think, you know, that statistics are coming back, that a lot of people who wouldn't be seeing church are seeing church in the comfort of their own living rooms. I also know that it's a more casual relationship with it, if, you know, for someone like me, it's different going and gathering and being with. And if anything, I think that it really informs, kind of going back to some of the stuff I was talking about, it informs me of like, yes, as an individual, I can do this, but wow, how much more can I do when I am with a group of people who hold the same values out in the culture? And that's what I'm missing. And I don't know what the next phase in that is. I do think that when we are finally able to gather again, it is incumbent upon us to celebrate loudly and let people see how happy we are to be together again, and to be in a loving, healing group of people who are trying to do their best at bringing the kingdom now. But that's kind of as far as I can get mentally until I know that we can gather again.
Yeah, I think Kristen, you bring up some really good points. I go back to what N.T. Wright talked about, where he used the term weeping, that, you know, the early believers in the church right after the crucifixion, they went through weeping, they were behind locked doors, and there was a lot of doubt. So the very early church, there was lots of weeping. Christ just died on the cross. There was a lot of behind locked doors because there's fear of persecution. And then there were a lot of doubt. We know from Thomas that there was a lot of doubt. And so those are some of the emotions that people could be experiencing. But I know that, you know, I'll even speak for myself. This is a personal Eric confession here. I know that this has gone on for so long that I have found myself, you know, being like, gosh, you know, like, yeah, I don't want to experience all these negative emotions anymore right now. And so I've kind of gone into the checked out realm, where let me just kind of do my thing in my sphere, and let me just kind of check out. Let me go back to those things that feel good, like watching Netflix and all those things. And I think that what the church is called individually and corporate to right now is to go back. And, you know, my wife, for instance, she is always on the news, and I mean, too much news could be a bad thing, mind you, but she likes to go on, like, where are we at? Where's the loss? So let's really lean into the pain that's going on right now. And I think that's really important for us as we're doing this as a church body. And then, Kristen, you talked about, like, what does this mean that we can't leave our homes? Like, what can we do with this pain in our own sphere right now? And what does that look like? And I think about that about that for myself individually. How am I dealing with this pain in my, you know, siloed relationship with God, which is still a part of our faith, even though it's individualistic? But how is this changing and moving my personal faith? How is this changing? You know, how is all this extra stress and discomfort, how is it even impacting my family? Because all of us know we're living around people in close quarters a lot more. And there's some high highs and there's some very low lows. So how am I taking that extra discomfort, and how am I leaning into it and developing and growing through these trials and tribulations? Because I think that's where we as Christians can take action right now. And also, like others were saying, even with our neighbors in our actual neighborhoods, how are we ministering in safe and reasonable ways to those around us? I don't think it's us, you know, like I've seen on the news, going into a public square with hundreds of us singing praise music with no masks on. I don't think that's it. I don't think that's how we're going to do it. But I think there's ways that we can start individually and build up from there. And even doing what we're doing now and trying to figure out, what does this look like for OPC in our community? How do we lean into the pain and learn from it, and also move forward, have that pain speak into action that's reasonable for us to do in safe ways now. I think that's kind of where I think about some of this stuff. And I think that's how we can potentially move forward in this time.
We're almost out of time. If any of you participants have a question, feel free to use the chat feature and you can write it out and we'll try to get to a couple of those. But yeah, for those who haven't been at OPC's outdoor service, Jeff can say from the beginning, have been very cautious about us, how do we meet? How do we do all this? And it feels like we didn't do anything for a long time because we were like, let's just sit and wait and be safe and, not do extra harm and all that kind of stuff. But it has been really great. We've been meeting for, 3-4 weeks and it feels incredibly safe. And it's really, nice to be together, even if we can't sing, even if we're in masks, and that as Christian, you're talking about that disconnect of feeling isolated or, that can be a moment that reminds us again, just like looking at the news for Lauren of, that we belong to something bigger and that we have a role to pray together, to meet together, to reach out to people, and to be encouraged in that when we're together. So as we're waiting to see if any questions come in, anything else from you guys on the panel that you just really want to share from the book, from your thoughts as we've been wrestling with this for a few weeks, that you think would be really helpful?
One thing for me I was thinking about is there's this term in the study of theology called God of the gaps. And what it is when we live in a scientific world and we come up with all these scientific explanations for how the world works, and then we get to a place or something we can't understand. And then we go to what's called God of the gaps. So we have a gap, we can't figure it out, and so we leave it in the realm of superstition. And so it slowly pushes God out of our world or understanding. And I was thinking about, this reclaiming of the narrative of the church, this understanding that what we're here for and what we exist. And, what I get to hear that a lot of people don't is, our deacons have been calling their whole parishes, checking in to see if people are okay. And they've been organizing food for shut-ins who can't get out but still live at home, and then different people getting their grocery list and getting their groceries for them. And my thought is, playing off of Luther and everything else, if we shift a little bit of our focus from, when can getting together feel normal, which we all want, to how do we take that understanding of the church is within the church and then take it into our neighborhoods and say, who in my neighborhood is an elderly person and how do I check in with them? And how do I see if someone's making sure they're okay? And how do I make sure they're getting food? And how do I make sure the resources? Or, these various things where when I think if you want to say, how do we go back and learn the lessons from those before us? We start thinking of the church as being relevant in our neighborhoods, in our caring for the people around us who aren't part of the community, not from some motivation to get them to come to church, but because that's who we are. And I think when we start doing that, we find ways that when we do come back together, we're going to be celebrating all the things we've seen God do around us, not just that we get to be back together.
Yeah, and I loved the quote that Eric shared about the way the church started with the locked doors and the weeping and all of that. There's a place for us, as Henrik is saying, to work on our own faith, to have this be, it's when the Spirit comes that then the church goes out and starts after that. We need to reconnect with God, using this moment to work on, what is prayer? How do we be filled with the Spirit? How do we discern where God is calling us to act and not act? Listening for that nudging of what neighbor do we need to go visit and do, minister to. there's lots, great conversation. We appreciate you all participating and joining us for this. Hopefully we left you wanting more. I know there's lots more that I could share, and I know from all of you we had more questions we talked about ahead of time, but want to respect people's time. And this was about an hour, and so thank you. I wonder, Jeff, if you would close us in prayer, just prayer for our church, prayer for us all in the midst of this, and then we'll say goodbye.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. Lord, I pray that you would give us the wisdom to know when to grieve and who to grieve with. I pray that you would give us the strength to reach beyond the narratives that our world gives us, to find the truth of your word that comes to us in the scripture and through your spirit. I pray that you would pray with us when we don't know even what to pray for. And I pray that you would make abundantly clear to our hearts how we can be your people in the midst of this pandemic in ways that care and love other people. So be present with us, Lord. Fill our hearts with your presence and make us selfless enough to give that presence away, that we might be your people. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all.
Thanks for hosting, Meg.